So I'm going to read an excerpt from the chapter on Lincoln, which is the most Indiana chapter and also my favorite chapter. Is that a coincidence? I'll never tell. But it's the context you should have is that there's this general store called Robert Stockwell Merchant. And you know, in the 19th century, it was really hard to find bookstores. Indianapolis didn't get its first bookstore until 1833. And the books they would get, like they could get the new Charles Dickens, but it would come a couple years later than it would come in Philadelphia, just because books had to, you know, there's no Amazon, so books had to physically move around the country. And so somebody like Lincoln, who was living close to Princeton, Indiana, which is a very small town, there was a general store there, but there were certainly no bookstores. But even that general store could be important to an enterprising young reader. One time, when Lincoln was a teenager, he went to Princeton, Indiana to get his stepmother's wool carded. As he rode into town, he spotted the sign for Robert Stockwell Merchant, the first time in his life he'd seen a sign with gold lettering. At the town mill, a clerk told him it would take several hours to finish his order. Lincoln spent a few minutes observing the mill itself, then headed 1 block west to the town square. He may have passed part of his afternoon in Stockwell's store, picking up and inspecting its latest books, a Bonaparte biography, a history of the Revolution. It would have been Lincoln's first chance to browse a partial bookstore. Lincoln could not have afforded even one of those titles. Still, he discovered ways to read. Some of his wealthier acquaintances, an old judge, a merchant in another town, lent him more books and newspapers. And Lincoln would read anything, even if he didn't always read it all the way through. Dusty classics, trashy bestsellers, the textbooks and anthologies floating among the other school children. Lincoln had to find time to read, given his local chores. He had to find places to read, an underrated challenge when as many as 13 people crammed into his family's 360-square-foot cabin. Most of all, he had to face those who did not approve. His father would whip him for reading instead of working, but Lincoln refused to quit. His cousin, one of the people who lived in that cabin, remembered Lincoln like this: he was a constant and, I may say, a stubborn reader.